A truck driver hit the gas. The road gave way beneath him. New York's West Side Highway just collapsed under its own weight. Nobody died that day, but the message was clear. This wasn't a pothole problem, this was a dying road. So the city planned something massive, a buried highway, a hidden parkway. Millions poured in before a single beam went up. They called it Westway, and it would cost the city more than money. Quick question before we get into it. Where are you watching from today? New York had a plan, a brilliant one, but the plan had an enemy nobody saw coming. December 1973, rush hour on the West Side Highway. A dump truck loaded with asphalt drove over a weak stretch near Gansevoort Street. The road simply broke apart underneath it. Steel bent, concrete crumbled into the street below. The truck fell almost 15 feet. The driver survived. The highway didn't. City officials shut the elevated road immediately. Not just that section, the whole thing. A road that once carried thousands of cars a day was suddenly gone. This wasn't a surprise, though. Engineers had been warning about it for years. The Miller Highway, as it was originally called, opened back in 1930. It was built for a different era. Cars were lighter then, trucks were smaller. Nobody imagined the traffic that would eventually crawl across it every single day. Decades of salt, weather, and neglect had eaten through the structure. Maintenance funds kept getting cut. Repairs kept getting delayed. The city treated the highway like it would last forever. It didn't. So now New York faced a real problem. Manhattan's entire west side depended on this route. Without it, trucks had nowhere to go. Businesses along the waterfront lost easy access. Traffic backed up for blocks in every direction. City planners had two choices: rebuild the same elevated highway or think bigger. They chose bigger. The idea that emerged wasn't just a repair job, it was a total reimagining of the waterfront. Bury the highway underground, build landfill out into the Hudson River, create acres of new parkland right on top of the tunnel. Below the surface, cars and trucks. Above it, green space, housing and offices. It sounded incredible on paper, a highway nobody would even see. A waterfront finally opened back up to the people who lived there. Planners called it Westway. And almost everyone loved the idea immediately. Real estate developers saw new land appearing out of nowhere. Politicians saw thousands of construction jobs. Residents saw a chance to reclaim a waterfront that had been blocked off by concrete for 50 years. The federal government liked it too. Interstate highway funding meant Washington would cover 90% of the cost. For New York, this looked like free money solving an old problem. By 1974, the proposal was finalized. A 4-mile stretch from the Battery to 42nd Street, landfill extending into the river, a 6-lane highway buried below new parkland. On paper, it solved everything. The dead highway would be gone. Manhattan would get new land. The waterfront would finally belong to the people again. Nobody had built anything like it before. Nobody had checked what the river actually needed either. The dream was set. Now it needed something dreams rarely survive: politics, money, and time. Getting a plan approved and getting a plan built are two very different things. Westway needed federal sign-off. It needed environmental review. It needed billions of dollars committed across multiple presidential administrations. That kind of project doesn't move fast even when everyone agrees it should happen. Still, momentum kept building through the late 1970s. Governor Nelson Rockefeller supported it early. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan called it a design of genius, comparing its potential impact to Central Park itself. Mayor Ed Koch backed it too, seeing thousands of construction jobs for a city still recovering from near bankruptcy. In 1977, Transportation Secretary William Coleman formally approved the project as part of the federal interstate highway system. That approval unlocked serious funding. The estimated costs at around $1.2 billion, with the federal government covering 90%. Engineering planning began on the proposed 4-mile segment. Surveys, environmental studies, detailed blueprints for landfill placement and tunnel construction. Every dollar spent here went toward paperwork, not pavement. Nothing had been built yet, but the machine was running, and running expensively. By 1981, the project reached its high point. On Labor Day, President Ronald Reagan traveled to New York City himself. He stood before cameras and presented a symbolic check for $85 million, the first installment toward purchasing the right-of-way. Reagan called Westway a victory over bureaucratic inertia. He said the project had been stuck in red tape for a decade, and now it was finally moving. His speech framed it as proof that big American projects could still get built. It was a huge moment. A sitting president, live on television celebrating a highway that didn't exist yet. Behind the scenes, though, the design and demolition costs kept climbing. Tens of millions were already spent just preparing the ground for construction that hadn't started. Consultants, engineers, and lawyers billed the state for years of planning work. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into. Massive builds that almost happened, and the reasons they didn't. Hit subscribe if you want more of these. By the early 1980s, Westway had support from 4 presidents' worth of political momentum, roughly $2 billion in projected funding, and years of engineering work already completed. It seemed unstoppable. Every major player in New York politics had signed off on it at some point. But somewhere in the Hudson River, something else was happening, something nobody, in those planning meetings, had thought to check. Every president, governor, and banker had signed off. Nobody had asked the river. Marine biologists were doing routine surveys of the Hudson River in the late 1970s. What they found changed everything. The exact stretch of river marked for Westway's landfill wasn't empty water waiting to be filled. It was a nursery ground for striped bass. Young fish were using that shallow area to grow before heading out into open water. This mattered more than most people realized at first. Striped bass weren't some rare, obscure species. They were a major commercial and recreational fishery up and down the East Coast. Fishermen from Maine to Virginia depended on healthy bass populations for their livelihoods. Environmental groups saw an opening. If Westway's landfill destroyed this nursery habitat, it could damage fish populations across an enormous stretch of coastline. They filed a lawsuit under the Clean Water Act, arguing the project's environmental review had failed to properly account for the fish. It sounded like a minor technical objection. It wasn't. In 1982, a federal judge agreed with them. The court blocked the project, ruling that the environmental impact statement hadn't adequately studied the striped bass population. Suddenly, one of the most politically powerful infrastructure projects in America was stuck in legal limbo. Reagan's ceremony was 2 years old, money was already spent, and now a judge was saying the whole approval process needed to be redone. New York officials pushed back hard. They argued the delay would cost jobs and money the city desperately needed. Governor Mario Cuomo asked the Army Corps of Engineers to speed up its supplemental review. The Corps agreed to compress a 2-winter study into just one. Officials hoped this compromise would keep the project alive. It didn't fix the underlying problem. Court battles dragged on for years. Federal Highway Administrator Ray Barnhart openly expressed frustration with the constant delays, at one point refusing to approve additional millions for design and demolition costs, while the legal fight continued. Meanwhile, a private consulting firm working on Westway got caught covering up scientific evidence about the environmental damage the project would cause. The New York Times ran a story with a headline that left little room for interpretation. Corruption ignored. Public trust in the project started cracking. It wasn't just about fish anymore. It was about whether anyone involved had been honest from the start. Think about the scale of what was happening. A highway backed by a sitting president, multiple governors, and billions in committed federal funding was being stopped by a legal argument about baby fish in a river. It sounds almost impossible, but it was happening in real time, one court filing at a time. A judge could pause a highway. He couldn't stop what was already changing outside the courtroom. While lawyers argued over striped bass, something much larger was shifting across the entire country. Urban highways were falling out of favor, not just in New York, everywhere. Cities that had spent the 1950s and 60s tearing through neighborhoods to build elevated freeways were now starting to regret it. Boston, San Francisco, and Portland were all reconsidering their own urban highway projects. Some were actively tearing sections down. This wasn't a random trend. It came from decades of watching what these highways actually did to cities. Elevated freeways cut through poor and working-class neighborhoods more often than wealthy ones. They created noise, pollution, and physical barriers that split communities in half. They blocked waterfronts and river access that used to belong to everyone. By the late 1970s, a different kind of movement was gaining strength. People wanted their waterfronts back. They wanted parks, not overpasses. They wanted to walk to a river, not stare at concrete pillars holding up 6 lanes of traffic. San Francisco tore down its Embarcadero freeway after an earthquake damaged it, and the city discovered something surprising. Traffic didn't collapse without it. The waterfront became more valuable, not less. Stories like that spread. City planners across the country started asking a new question. Did every traffic problem actually need a bigger highway? Or were there better answers? This shift mattered enormously for Westway, even though the project itself was still tied up in court over environmental law, not urban planning philosophy. The world that approved Westway in 1974 wasn't the same world still fighting about it in the 1980s. Public opinion on urban highways had genuinely changed in less than a decade. Meanwhile, New York's mass transit system was falling apart. Subway cars broke down constantly. Graffiti covered every surface. Crime on trains scared away riders. The city's buses weren't much better. Transit advocates started asking an obvious question. If Westway's billions came from federal interstate highway funding, could that same money legally go toward fixing trains and buses instead? It turned out federal law actually allowed exactly that kind of substitution under certain interstate withdrawal programs. States could trade highway construction funds for transit funding in some circumstances. This idea started gaining real traction in Albany and Washington. Why spend $2 billion burying a highway nobody was sure the city still needed, when that same money could fix a transit system millions of New Yorkers used every single day? The legal fight over fish was still unresolved. But underneath it, the entire justification for Westway was quietly eroding. Westway wasn't just losing a lawsuit, it was losing its reason to exist, and 1985 would make that final. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals delivered its ruling in 1985. The judges upheld the lower court's decision. Westway's environmental review remained legally insufficient. The Army Corps of Engineers' permits to build in the Hudson River were declared invalid. For Westway supporters, this was close to a final blow. Years of legal fighting had produced the same result each time. The courts weren't going to let this project move forward as designed. New York officials made a decision that had once seemed unthinkable. They conceded. After more than a decade of planning, political fights, and courtroom battles, Westway was officially dead. No highway would be buried under the Hudson. No landfill would extend into the river. No parkland would rise above a tunnel that was never built. The financial toll was staggering when you added it up. Roughly $35 million had gone toward design work, environmental studies, legal fees, and partial demolition costs. All of it spent on a highway that would never carry a single car. For a moment, this looked like pure loss. Millions of taxpayer dollars over a decade of work, and nothing physical to show for any of it. Then came the twist nobody fully expected. The $1.725 billion in federal highway funding that had been earmarked for Westway didn't just disappear. Under federal rules allowing highway-to-transit fund swaps, that money became available for New York's mass transit system instead. This was an enormous amount of money landing at exactly the right moment. The city's subways and buses were in genuinely rough shape throughout the early 1980s. Trains broke down constantly, maintenance had been deferred for years, riders were abandoning the system in frustration. Suddenly, over $1 billion in federal funding flowed directly into fixing that crisis. New York's Transit Authority used the money to overhaul aging subway cars, repair deteriorating tracks, and modernize a system that had been quietly falling apart for decades. It became one of the largest transit funding boosts the city had ever received. Think about that trade for a second. Instead of a buried highway most New Yorkers would never even see, the money went toward a system that literally every resident of the city relied on daily. The failed highway indirectly funded one of the most important transit recoveries in New York's history. Nobody planning Westway back in 1974 could have predicted this outcome. They imagined a highway. They got a subway system instead, paid for by a road that was never built. The road was gone for good. What replaced it would end up worth more than the highway ever was. Walk along the Hudson River in Manhattan today, and you won't find a buried highway. You'll find Hudson River Park instead. Nearly 500 acres of green space, walkways and piers stretching along the waterfront from Battery Park City up toward 59th Street. Bike paths run for miles. Families sit on grass that used to be inaccessible waterfront blocked by rusting overpasses. None of it required burying a 6-lane interstate underneath. The park emerged gradually through the late 1980s and 1990s, built with a fraction of Westway's original budget. It didn't need billions of dollars in landfill and tunnel construction. It needed public land, some planning, and a much simpler vision. Meanwhile, the actual traffic problem that started this whole saga got solved differently too. A new surface-level roadway, eventually named the Route 9A reconstruction, replaced the old collapsed highway. It opened in stages through the 1990s and early 2000s. No landfill, no burial, no decade of court battles. Cars still moved through Manhattan's West Side just fine. Looking back at the entire Westway saga, the lesson isn't really about striked base or court rulings. Those were the mechanism, not the real cause. The real story is about timing. Westway was conceived in an era that still believed bigger highways solved city problems. By the time it was fully approved and funded, that belief was already crumbling across urban America. The project spent years fighting legal battles designed for a different decade's assumptions. Even if the lawsuits had gone the other way, Westway would have opened into a city that increasingly didn't want what it offered. This happens more often in construction history than people realize. Sometimes a project fails because the engineering was wrong, sometimes because the money ran out. But sometimes a project fails simply because the world changed faster than the blueprint could keep up. Westway wasn't badly designed. Engineers who worked on it later called portions of it genuinely innovative. The landfill technique, the parkland concept, the tunnel design, these weren't amateur ideas. The problem was that New York in 1985 no longer wanted what New York in 1974 had asked for. That's a much harder problem to solve than any engineering challenge. You can redesign a tunnel. You can't redesign public opinion once it's already shifted beneath you. $35 million bought New York a lesson instead of a highway. Sometimes that turns out to be the more valuable purchase. Westway taught New York something no blueprint ever could. Westway never moved a single car. But it helped rebuild a subway system and gave New York a waterfront park instead of buried concrete. Sometimes the best outcome isn't the one you planned for. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe. More lost construction history is coming your way.